Are in the home stretch of the semester. We have this week, and then we have a lecture next week, and then we have finals week, where we will be turning in our final project for the course. I hope everybody had a decent Thanksgiving um, and that they had enough time to work on their paper. I'm looking forward to reading what people submit. So I want to pick up where we left off from 2 weeks ago now, where we were talking about three-dimensional art. For that lecture, we spoke specifically about sculpture and what I refer to as sculptural objects. So sculpture is three-dimensional. Remember that. That is something physical, something that you can walk around, something you might even be able to move through or between. It has a length and a width and a depth. A height, a length, and a depth. 3 dimensions. And that's different than, of course, two-dimensional art, drawing and painting, which just has a height and a width. Okay, so again, we started with sculptural objects, and here's an image of the Woman of Willendorf. And I threw this on here to show that we, as human beings, have been making art or sculptural art for thousands of years. This sculpture or this object is about 28,000 years old. I spoke about the additive process where you are taking materials and assembling or like putting them together, assembling, constructing, or casting. Here's an example of sculpting or modeling, which is an additive process where you are taking clay and you are adding to it, really sculpting in that way, or modeling. Assembling, where you are taking different objects from around the world and putting them together into a single form. Constructing is where you have a plan, you have an idea, and you really build it in a very meaningful way. So that would be akin to building a house, or in this instance, a skate park. Casting is where you pour a liquid material into a mold, and then you open up that mold. The liquid dries or sets up, and you open up that mold, and you have a reproduction of the inside. This was cast bronze, so molten metal was poured into a mold. All right, so additive process is different than the subtractive process. Subtractive process mainly refers to carving. So that's stone carving or cutting or essentially just removing of material. So in this instance of this marble sculpture, Michelangelo, the artist, went in and he took away everything that wasn't his sculpture. He carved it out and subtracted material. Another subtractive sculpture by Michelangelo. This one is both additive and subtractive. It's additive because the chocolate in this sculpture was cast in a big mold. It's subtractive because the artist Janine Antoni, she was chewing on the chocolate, creating negative areas. So that is additive and subtractive. Here's a totem pole from the Pacific Northwest that is a traditional subtractive process. And then we talked about contemporary methods. Metal or steel construction. Assemblage, so that's taking many of one thing and adding them together. Ready-mades. Of course, we all did our ready-made projects 2 weeks ago. So our ready-made project, our ready-made sculpture is of an object that we find and present as a sculpture. ready-made poop. All right, mixed media. So in the 20th century, artists started mixing materials, adding them together, making a mishmash. So Robert Rauschenberg was a really good example of mixed media. Light sculpture. So artists working with light or the effects of light in a space. Here's a really great one by Tim Noble and Sue Webster where they cast a shadow on the wall using light. The sculpture is not complete without the use of light. And then we spoke about kinetic sculpture. Sculptures that move, sculptures that have kinetic energy. And then I showed you a video of this sculpture by the artist Martin Cressels. And the reason why I put this at the end of the presentation is because I feel like it's a good transition into what could be referred to as installation art or site-specific art. Sometimes sculptures, certainly ones of a certain size, can only exist in certain spaces. And so this object really walks the line between what's called sculpture and installation art. So here we are with the new material. We're going to be talking today about installation art, and then we'll be speaking about land art. Let's get started with installation. So what is installation art? Installation art is art that is created for a gallery space or outside. Installation is often large or even overwhelming at times. Though it too can be minimal and small, installation art requires space and the ability for a work of art to interact with the surroundings and/or alter sensory experiences of the viewer. Does that make sense to you? Installation art is often large, and you can think of it more of an environment or something that is very much something that can be walked through or experienced in a sensory level. And similar to installation art is site-specific. Site-specific art oftentimes is installation, but site-specific art is art that is entirely designed for and contingent on a given space or location. So installation art often can only exist in the space that it is intended to be. And we'll get into that in a moment. It is very common that installation art is site-specific, though not necessary. Sometimes installation art is dependent on the context of its surroundings. At other times, it is held up by surroundings. If site-specific art is to be relocated, the art is destroyed. So here is an installation. My question for you is this. Well, first of all, I've got a couple questions for you. What are we looking at, number one? And is it site-specific or not? So the artist Dan Flavin, often he would work with fluorescent light bulbs and light fixtures. And what we're looking at are, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. We have 11 yellow fluorescent tubes that are lined up vertical in a hallway. And it's shining yellow towards us. Backed up to those 11 light fixtures are 11 more light fixtures with red tubes in them. So we have red illuminating the back, yellow illuminating the front. What makes this installation art? Well, it's installation because it is using the space that it's in. It's creating a sensory experience. It's an environment. So these light fixtures are vertical, filling what looks to be a hallway. That is what separates it from sculpture, is because it's filling that space, creating an environment within that hallway. So, my question, big question is this site specific or is it not site specific? That is up for debate. Perhaps. This installation fits really well in this hallway. I would argue that it is site specific but movable, so somewhere in the middle. If you had another hallway that was built to the perfect dimensions, of course, this sculpture can move from one place to another. So I would say it's somewhere in between. This is an installation by an artist, Alan Capro. I don't find this installation very exciting. But the reason why I talk about it is because Alan Capro he's one of the very first artists to embrace installation art. So in the early 60s, you started seeing large art installations. Something called happenings were going on in New York City. And I'm sure you've heard of Andy Warhol. I've talked about him a bunch. He was involved in these happenings, and so were people like Alan Capro, where they would throw these warehouse parties, kind of trippy raves or whatever, and then these big artworks would be installed in rooms to create these different environments from room to room. And this is not a photo of a happening, what we're looking at. We are looking at a gallery where the artist, this is the artist here, he filled the gallery and the courtyard to the gallery with used tires. The idea was that he was in the space and really messing with the function of the gallery. Galleries are businesses. They're there to sell artwork generally, but he was able to take over the gallery and start doing an artwork that can't easily be sold. I suppose this was at an art museum. It was not at an art gallery. And this was at the Pasadena Art Museum. And art museums were very important at this time because they were one of the places where installations could happen. I'm sorry for saying a gallery. Here's a picture of the courtyard at the museum. So another, I suppose I just mentioned Andy Warhol. This is an installation by Andy Warhol. This is from the early 60s. This, or mid 60s. This, you would have seen installations like this in Andy Warhol's parties. Um, this is called Silver Clouds, and what you're looking at are these sort of pillow type things. They're balloons. They're rectangular balloons, but they're filled with helium, but they are sort of the perfect balance of helium and regular air. So these, pillows just they float in space. They're not going up, they're not going down per se. They might move around with the ventilation of the room, but they are these trippy balloons that are just at eye level or just in the space when you walk through. And you can still see this installation on display. Sometimes museums install them. It tends to be on display at a museum in Pittsburgh called the Andy Warhol Museum, where I've seen it before. Another video where people are just walking through the balloons or image. This is a site-specific installation by an artist named Yayoi Kusama. She is actually a very popular artist. She's very well known. She's one of the more well known artists living today, and this photo is from 1996, and she is in fact still alive. You see how old she is in that photo. But in this installation, this was at a different museum in Pittsburgh called the Mattress Factory, where she built a what she refers to as an infinity room, which is 4 walls that are made out of mirrors and then a ceiling made out of mirrors. And so this artwork is really built into the space. It is permanent. It's not going anywhere. It's been on display since 1996 in Pittsburgh, and it is very site specific. This installation actually has 2 rooms, and I don't have an image of the second room. So sorry, told you. But there is a second room with similar mannequins, and except the lighting in there is sort of blue. Here's another site-specific installation by an artist named James Turrell. This is from 1980, and you can visit it at a museum in New York City called PS1, where he cut a hole in the roof. And you can go in and you can sit in this room and hang out. It's very peaceful, very perfect. Here's a picture of these benches, and that is the hole. Lights coming in. It's if you're looking for a place to rest when you're in New York, it's actually a really great spot. The site-specific installation is again like Yayoi Kusama. It is again built into the space. It cannot possibly go anywhere because it is a modified building. All right, so last week we actually did speak a bit about Tara Donovan. Do you remember talking about her? She's the one that did all the assemblage, where this is all styrofoam cups that are glued together to create these clouds, and she hung them from the ceiling. This is site specific, but it goes from museum to museum. It's very popular work. And in each instance, the rooms are all different sizes. So she has to install them. It gets installed in a different way each time. So these are actually made out of different pieces that sort of come together in different ways. Now, I'm going to show you a clip of an absolutely wild site-specific installation. This happened at a gallery in New York City called the Deitch Projects. And imagine the gallery being a giant room that's, the ceilings are 20 feet tall, 30 feet tall. It's a big white cube. So it's like 30 feet tall, 30 feet wide, 30 feet long. And these artists, uh, part of a group, Black Acid Co op, they came in and they took that empty cube and they built all new rooms and hallways and multiple levels in the gallery. I want to show you a quick tour. All right, so there's this crazy guy in New York that has a little camcorder, and he goes to all of the show openings, and he, you know, annoys people, but he does a really good job of documenting what's going on um, in these different galleries. So uh, it's really great watching him to see the artwork around New York. So this is him showing up a day or a week too early to the show. And then there's the opening of the show. But I do want to let's so you walk in and you're in some sort of like Chinatown store selling weird objects. And you go through the back of the store. We're still in the store. You go through the back of the store and you get into these weird, funky back rooms that are all sort of meth labs and they're all bombed out and gross. I don't think they're not actual meth labs, but they are reminiscent of. So that's another room, and then he's about to walk into an art gallery type thing. None of these rooms were there before these guys started. And they went in and they built everything. It's just a maze, like a labyrinth. So it's pretty wild. This is an example of an installation on steroids. This is another really great one by the artist Roger Hiorns, where he pumped a liquid into an apartment. So let's see. He like sealed. He rented this apartment. I don't think he even owned it. He rented this apartment, sealed off the corners, did all this, made it watertight, and he pumped this liquid into the apartment. And that liquid, called I think cupric nitrate, which is like a copper e solution, it started growing crystals all over the walls. And then uh, he drained the liquid, and then you're left with an apartment that you could actually walk through that has crystals on the walls. So here's someone with a, their iPhone recording what's around. I suppose the lighting isn't very good, but you can walk around that room. It's pretty wild. Then lastly, in terms of installation art, I want to talk about um, a monumental project by this artist. This is James Turrell. So James Turrell, he's the one that cut the hole in the ceiling at that museum in New York, and he also did that light sculpture with the blue wall. He in 1975 bought a piece of land in Arizona, maybe New Mexico, um, and that land incorporated this. This is a crater from a like an ancient like volcano, I think, and he started tunneling into it and creating these rooms and chambers. And this is what it looks like inside. So now you can walk through tunnels or from the outside through tunnels and see these different chambers and rooms that he built. I want to show a video of this one too. So this is an interview. We might not listen. We probably shouldn't. So that's the landscape. It's Arizona in the Painted Desert. And then that's the old volcano. And his idea was to be able to use the shape of the crater to gather light from the sun and even at night from the starlight and be able to light up these tunnels. Let's go back to that image. So these are, I suppose you can walk in from one side. So this is the edge of the landscape, and you're able to walk in and underground through these tunnels. Yeah.
Things that we intellectually knew. Because it's not something I discover and then have captured for you. It's something that you are there to discover yourself. You have to complete that yourself. You leave the east portal and go down this ramp, and then there is the joining of where the two ramps would come together, and then you go down in a spiral to the crater side, to this chamber that's in the center of the crater. One question I always ask is, why go inside to see out? You can see the sky anytime you want, but that's not telling the story of how we see the sky and how our perception and our seeing forms the sky. Prejudiced perception allows us not to see things that really are as they are. We award the sky its color. We're quite unaware of this. Because we do, that means that I can then change it. I can work something around you that then will change your perception. And I think that artists working with the nature of perception, or how we go about doing this, is also of great importance, because we do have this prejudice seeing that many of the artists are trying to take away that prejudice. If you use light to tell a story, then you're not using the power of light, you're using the power of the story, which has its own power. But I wanted to use it without that, so I can't have it with an image exactly. No image, and then there's no object even, and there's no particular place of focus. No. Well, what do you have left? A drink. Our time here is largely because these events form us. That is, moods change with cycles of the moon. They certainly change with the seasons. They change with the weather, which has a lot to do with sunspots and all that you go through it, and these are called light.
So that is James Turrell's Rodent Crater. I think it's pretty wonderful. I can't imagine doing that on the scale that he's doing it. Um, he has he's a very famous artist who is really broke because all of his money goes into this project, and he's gone bankrupt several times, which is why it's taken 45 years uh, to really complete. All right, so I wanted to show this project because it last in the installation art, because this is another one that walks the line between two types of art. Next, I want to talk about land art. So, of course, this is installation, but it's also built into the landscape. Land art is created for a landscape by modifying the natural features of that land. So, digging a hole artfully, that would be land art. Building a mound artfully, that is also land art. Humans have been doing land art to some capacity for a very long time. Not every culture is known for having done land art, but are you familiar with something called the Nazca Lines in Peru? This area of Peru is essentially a desert. There's nothing growing there. It's very arid. In I think the 1950s or 60s, an airplane flew over this part of the world for the very first time, and they actually rediscovered these giant animals that are on the surface of the ground. So this animal, I suppose, would be a monkey. If you go down and look, you'd see that the way these lines are made is the people who built it didn't dig trenches per se. They actually just moved stones. So it's all they took all the whitish stones and lined them up to create these lines. Moved all the brownish stones away. So there are several of these in Peru. These are called the Nazca Lines. Definitely quirky and interesting and worth looking into. So this was made, I don't know, I guess either 500 years BC or 500 years AD. So that's 1,000-year time span that we don't really know anything about. But they're there and they're very cool. This is something from Ohio, the Great Serpent Mound built by the Adena culture around 300 years ago. And there there's been a string of cultures historically in the Midwest of the United States that have been mound builders. And here we have a sculpted out snake. And it is gobbling up an egg or something round. This is a site called Cahokia, and it's actually in Illinois on the Mississippi River in southwestern Illinois, pretty much across the Mississippi River from St. Louis, Missouri. But this is a site of many, many large mounds. Some things are buried. Things are buried in some of them. Other places there isn't anything known to be buried in them. Some mounds were built to have temples or buildings on top of them. But it's a whole complex of mounds. Which brings me up to the present. This is an artwork that many of you will be like, come on, professor, what the heck is this? But I'm telling you, it's been in textbooks for a long time. So I suppose it's art. This is made by the artist Richard Long. And of course, it is called A Line Made by Walking, where the artist in a field with grass walked in a straight line back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and trampled the grass down. It's a subtle line. It's a subtle modification of the landscape. But in the 1960s, we started seeing artists really think about modifying landscape in a very artful way. And some of the first attempts were very minimal like this, and others were actually quite big. In this image, we have a sculpture called Double Negative, or a land art called Double Negative, where the artist took earth moving equipment and started removing dirt on two sides of a gorge. So this is the Moapa Valley in Nevada. It's it's not populated. This place is very, very isolated. So there's not even a bridge to go to the other side of this for miles and miles. So he had this earth moving equipment, and he starts digging and digging, and he cuts a channel here. And then he drives 20 miles to the closest bridge, drives back 20 miles, and then digs here. It's supposed to be in a straight line. This is a more extreme modification. This is interesting to me because of the scale of it. How big do you think this is? I'm sure you can imagine that distance, and it is, I don't know, it's far. Maybe a half a mile across. You see right here? That's the artist Michael Heiser standing on the edge, looking at his work. That's how big this is. Here's a really famous land art called Spiral Jetty. This is by an artist named Robert Smithson. who he created a wall of rocks, a little path that goes out into the Great Salt Lake in Utah, and it just spirals around. This is an old photo from the 1970s. Turns out the Great Salt Lake, the water level goes up and down. A lot of people may not be aware of that. But when it rises and goes down and then rises again, it's a process that takes years, sometimes decades. This land art disappeared under the water in, I don't know, I want to say about 1980. And it re-emerged only a couple years ago. So you can now go walk on it again. It's really interesting to me that you could build an artwork that is really affected by the landscape or the conditions around the landscape. This is a really great installation / land art piece called The Lightning Field by Walter de Maria, 1977. So 400 stainless steel poles, and it measures, this is weird, but they're in a grid measuring 1 mile one direction and 1 kilometer the other direction. This is in another remote landscape, but the idea is that these poles will attract lightning. So there's a cabin on this property, and to this day you can sign up to stay there. Again, you're by yourself, you're in the middle of nowhere, but you sign up to stay there and you hope for a lightning storm. And you might get one. So I think this is very cool, sort of capturing lightning. And then this is a small piece. This is, I'd say, more of a very hyper minimally invasive sculpture. This is by the artist Andy Goldsworthy. And Andy Goldsworthy is known for doing lots of little modifications to the landscape. Nothing that affects the landscape in a bad way. But here is a big a sculpture that he made where he went out into the land and gathered a bunch of icicles and then stuck them together to make this star. All right, that is it for our lecture on installation art, site-specific installation art, and land art. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. After this video, go ahead and watch the Art of the Day video and then take the quiz.